Dear Twist. This was a sweet little girl. Happy, cheerful, read any and everything, but too young for the headlines. So very apolitical, very trusting and not inclined to expect trouble. I had a weird childhood, until my grandmother moved too far away from my mother for her to conveniently use her for a babysitter, so she abandoned me. My grandmother worked on an orchard near White Salmon, Washington, so I too went west, onto Mount Adams Orchard B. As an avid reader, I had of course read books in my age range, and though I remember very little of myself as a person until I came to Washington, I recall events pretty clearly. I had been told that the orchard sat right at the foot of this gigantic mountain, Mount Adams, and was in its very shadow. At that time, I had never seen a mountain. The plains and breaks of Missouri had no high spots. Though the Ozarks of Arkansas and Kentucky and Tennessee were pretty, they hardly fit my view of living in the shadow of a mountain so high and steep that it would cast a shadow. I was not disappointed. It was such a relief. We got off the train in Yakima, and I saw my first real Indians in immaculate and highly starched and ironed white dress shirts, with long braids. What a thrill. It still is. A memory of a really different time between the past and, what was then, the present. We waited in Yakima for a few days, probably for transportation. One day while we were there, all the bells and horns and whistles in Yakima began to blow. Thankfully, the Second World War was over. The orchard was really pretty, and someday Twist, I'd like to go back. When I was there was an abandoned homestead that was completely overgrown with lilacs, so thick you could scarcely get around, and a profusion of irises that you would have to see to believe. The smell of this place was nothing short of glorious. The ranch and its unplanned splendor? Breathtaking. One day, when I drove the baseball team to the river in the driver's education car, I sat by some lilacs in bloom. In memory of that innocent and happy time, I recently wrote this poem about that place, the orchard, surrounded by great forests and brightened by this special wild place. Here is my poem. When I was a child I ran wild and free, like the wind that sighed through the tall pine trees. Now, I have a child, and I wish he could see all the things that molded me, and smell all the lilacs that grew wild and free when I was a child. For the first time in my life, I didn't live in a city. There was no place to go, and nothing artificial to do, no demands, beyond chores in the kitchen, and almost no one to play with, so I did pretty well inventing a life. I had books, and school, and baseball, and there was my tree, from which I could see that great soft round mountain all covered with snow. It became my life and I loved it. It is my very best memory as a child. No stress, free from the constant waiting for the other shoe to fall that living with my mother entailed. It was the first time I had really been free. My grandmother loved me so much, and I am so grateful to her. She is a very precious memory to me, and though she has been dead for almost 20 years, I love her yet today. She was a serene person, never complained, and was liked by everyone, good-natured and genuinely kind. Not the run and do for kind of kindness, just every day along the way. The only thing that bothered her was she couldn't stand my constant whistling. It drove Kelly nuts. He was a lot older than her, about 10 years, a crusty old bachelor cook who never had children of his own, and he was good to me, and I liked to help him in the kitchen. But he couldn't handle my whistling. As a child I sang and whistled a lot, a trait I still had when we moved here, to Culver, Oregon. Bob Frazier's mother once commented to someone in the store that,
"Carolyn Gates is here, I can hear her singing."
I was reminded of this the other day on the phone when Katie told me she was about at her wit's end, as Zachary had decided he was a bee, and had spent 2 days going. The orchard was a very big one, and kept 12 to 20 men working year-round. In the spring they sprayed all the trees with yellow sulfur, which stinks really bad, and we had to cover the whole kitchen with something, probably sheets when they sprayed the trees closest to the cookhouse. The dining room was in 2 parts, and was separated by great big folding doors which were kept closed until harvest, when we served 120 to 140 men 3 meals a day. There was a giant iron triangle which it was a great honor to ring. We had first bell, announcing to the camp that they had 10 minutes to wash up, and second bell which called them to the tables. The tables were preset with plates upside down. It was my job year-round to set the tables after the dishes were washed at night, but at the harvest they hired girls to help. There was a walk-in cooler in a small cellar at the back of the kitchen in which they kept great big rounds of Tillamook yellow cheese, and lots of butter, and a hanging meat room, for we were far from town, the town being White Salmon, Washington. Once a week or every 2 weeks, depending on how many we were feeding, Kelly made an order, and the big boss who lived in the big house made the trip in for supplies. My, how I did love that cheese. Twist. The rolls were a foot in diameter, and Kelly's great sharp knives could just go through it pretty easy. He didn't often let me cut my own, but once, when he did, I sliced my finger to the bone. I'll show you the scar if you'd like. I ate my cheese just as is, with a dill pickle to wash it down. The little girl who moved from a life of bread and sugar for breakfast, and whatever she could scrounge in her mother's empty cupboards, became lost in having everything she could want, and as the onset of puberty began, so did the weight gain. By the end of my first year there, I weighed 142 pounds, at least half of which was my breasts. There were only 3 girls in our combined 5th and 6th grade class. Laura Clark was a little Mormon girl with braided hair parted in the middle, and Nola Woods was a Class A hardy bully, with a tender streak not so deeply buried. It was Nola who told me I should have a brassiere, but my grandmother thought that was something my mother, who no one even knew where she was, should take care of, so I went unchained and unfettered to school in the only clothes I owned. Sweaters. To this day, I will not wear a t-shirt or tight sweater, for I really was ugly. The boys began pestering me and making awful remarks that I didn't understand. I hated when they tried to touch me. At this time, I had never seen a naked male body, and had no idea of male anatomy, much less sex. I was really puzzled when the terrible trio, Tommy Maupin, Raymond Martin, and the other Raymond, began teasing another boy, Stanley Shaddich, about which or what. I couldn't understand, other than it was a real tragedy, spoken of only in whispers, because Stanley was much bigger and pretty tough. When I asked, I was told that poor Stanley only had one nut. Whatever that was. Even Nola couldn't clear that one up for me. Poor Nola. Her mom killed her dad the spring after I moved back to Yakima, and her mom was sent to prison for 8 years. I became Nola's special charge, and she rode her horse down and took me riding. I was thrilled to death, but while the ride to her house was the answer to a dream, when we neared her home, the horse bolted and ran for the barn, with both of us hanging on for dear life. He rounded a corner too close to a tree and we both got stung pretty good. I spent the night there in the top bunk of a very cold drafty cabin, and she kept pulling the covers off, so I nearly froze. She had a really rough exterior, but such a good heart. Tommy, Raymond, and the other Raymond all died in their 20s. Tommy drowned in Puget Sound, and I don't remember what happened to the other 2. Chip and Bodge Cries were from a cattle ranch, and were the only kids with money, as far as any of us knew. Chip was our catcher, and was square-built, but not fat, while Bodge had to have a big horse to match his size. Me and Chip were the best softball players, and we played another little school that came for May Day. We took the stage. Yes, the stage, to school each day, and the bus back. The stage delivered the mail, and gave way to the school bus shortly after I got there. The funniest thing. I have this recurring dream, where I go up this back road where the stage picked us up, and make the arch around the other way. It is a hard trip, and sometimes I am looking for old friends, but it is always too hard to get to their place, so I never see them, although I find their house. The road is always very slick and snow-covered, and comes out in country that doesn't resemble where I lived. We had to walk a ways to the bus. And I remember being escorted by a grown-up with a gun when we found cougar tracks in the snow. Pretty scary stuff. You probably have never heard a cougar scream. I am sorry for that, for I have. Wow. Our school at Husum was 3 rooms, 6 grades, 3 teachers, and had a great cook. Oh yes, and a gymnasium. Husum was a 2-hour walk in the summer, which was allowed but not often. And home on time or else. So 2 hours there. 2 hours to swim. And 2 hours to get home. Fall on the orchard was when they harvested. In the winter they pruned, and in the spring they thinned. Nowadays, they thin with chemicals, I think. We almost never went to town. Summer was the slow season. I went on Saturdays with someone else, as we didn't own a car, and they would drop me off at the movies at 11 a.m. I sat and watched movies with the boys until they came back for me. I saw lots of Perils of Pauline and other serials, where the heroine or hero faced a certain death weekly, but was always rescued. Lots and lots of Hopalong Cassidy, and Roy Rogers and Dale Evans. I saw Roy Rogers and Dale Evans in person once, years later, when I was about 14 years old, in St. Louis. I watched Gone with the Wind at that old theater in Bingen, Washington. Wow. But Roy and Hoppy were best. This was the best 18 months of my life, while I was still my own person. I remember this little person. For some reason, regarding what came after, I can remember the events. But not myself. Perhaps, this is what is wrong with the children who don't think of themselves as preteens. I hope you will hold and keep safe this sweet little person. She was worth remembering.